Welcome to the latest edition of the MBN Iran podcast. With me today is Dr. Mehrzad Bouroujerdi, who is the Dean of the College of Arts, Sciences, and Education at the Missouri University of Science and Technology. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to start off and talk about something that happened a few days ago, which is that you had an article published, a piece in the New York Times, the Sunday New York Times, about your own personal experience that draws together something that happened to you, a tragedy that happened to your family in 1978, just before Christmas of 1978, as things were beginning to heat up in Iran, as the revolution, which was pretty much around the corner at the time, was approaching. And the article is called "This is What My Father's Assassination Taught Me About the War in Iran." And I want to open up with that. And can you kind of run through what happened at that time and tell us and our audience about your own experience? And they can also look the article up themselves, of course.
So we'd be happy to. Yes. So, as some of our listeners or viewers might recall, Iran was engulfed in revolutionary demonstrations in 1978. And the Shah's regime in late August of 78 declared martial law regime. And shortly after that, Ayatollah Khomeini, who was living in exile in Iraq, went to France and continued with his revolutionary, agitation against the Shah, back then. This led to the declaration of martial law and, massive demonstrations in the streets of various Iranian cities. And the Iranian Revolution started to, gain momentum. That's around the time exactly where I left to come to the U.S. to, finish my high school studies. And my father, who was an oil engineer for the Iranian Oil Company, he, accompanied me to U.S. Iranian Oil Company had a practice of sending their engineers for, further advanced training in the U.S. So that was his turn to come to Texas to undergo this training. And so while he was here, this revolutionary momentum started to gain, further steam. So by the time he went back to Iran after, 40 days or so, the revolution was, sort of fully functional in a way. And the Shah wanted the oil industry, of course, to continue operating because oil was the lifeblood, economic lifeblood of the country. And Ayatollah Khomeini had called upon oil workers to go on a strike, right, as a way of crippling the Shah's government economically. Caught between these two, demands, because of his position in the oil company, my father continued going to work. Some of the lieutenants of Ayatollah Khomeini that were involved in a militant Islamic guerrilla organization, wanted to make sure that the strike was going to be fully successful, and therefore they targeted individuals who were continuing to go to work and were in managerial position. So on December 23rd of 1978, in two simultaneous attacks, they assassinated my father along with his American counterpart, a gentleman who was on loan from Texaco to Iranian Oil Company back then. And these twin assassinations basically brought everything to a halt in terms of oil production. It led to the departure of many foreigners who were working in the Iranian oil sector back then. And these individuals who then, had carried on these assassinations went on to become leading military and intelligence officials of the Islamic Republic from the get-go, I guess, because they had proven their mettle by having carried on, assassinations. And there were, more than these two. There were a few other, policemen, etc., here and there, civil bureaucrats who were assassinated in the months leading to the 79 revolution. So in the New York Times article that you referenced, I talk about some of these individuals, who they were, and how they got to be where they are, and use that as an opening to argue that the Iranian regime is much more resilient, much more durable than people give it credit to. And, we should keep that lesson in mind as we contemplate how this war might eventually come to an end.
That's one of the things that I realize is I think for people who don't specialize in Iran, especially when it's about the leadership of the country, and because it's not a democracy, people don't rise up through the ranks in a public way, if you will, as opposed to other countries where you can track somebody's career openly because they run for office and get promotions. Iran, of course, continues not to be a democratic country, and people achieve power and influence and authority in different ways, namely through the internal machinations of the system. And one of the things that's really fascinating about your article is that you highlight that some of these people who were involved, basically in killings, are now in leadership positions. And these are the people that the U.S. is now negotiating with. And these are, very clever people who were good at carrying out assassinations in 1978, 79, and now continue to now in positions of official authority are the people that the U.S. is sitting across the table from, if you will. And it's interesting. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So this group of men really have an interesting story, in the sense that not only they carried on these assassinations, many of them were from this southwestern province of Iran, Khuzestan, where I'm from too. And, of course, a year into the Iranian Revolution, we have the beginning of the Iran-Iraq War, right? But since these guys were native boys, they knew the region, and therefore basically go ahead and uh, uh, advise the Iranian leadership in terms of the conduct of the war, right? And so they went up in the ranks thanks to their local knowledge of the tapestry of the area. And so at a very young age, one of these individuals that I mentioned in the article basically became the head of the Revolutionary Guards and went on to occupy that position for 16 years, and then moved on to even higher positions, becoming secretary of the Expediency Council for the state and so forth. And his lieutenants, others who were involved in the organization with him, basically went on to other interesting careers in the military establishment in Iran. One of them became Minister of Revolutionary Guards, then became Minister of Defense, and then National Security Council member. He is the individual that negotiated on behalf of Iran with Saudi Arabia that rapprochement that took place in China in 2023. And he was killed in an Israeli bombing raid on the Supreme Leader's house, a few months ago. Others became really the architects, the military planners, the thinkers for the Revolutionary Guards in that sense. So, and another one again is the current National Security Council member, a gentleman by the name of Mohammad Bagher Zulqadr, who is a interesting case in and of itself, with serious millenarian beliefs and so forth. And now he is the most important military security decision maker in the country. Furthermore, members of this underground group were also very much responsible in organizing Iraqi POWs and making them into a fighting force against Saddam Hussein. The Badr Brigade that the Iranians created, which was the predecessor to the Quds Force for Iran, was made up of these POWs. One of the members of this group was in charge of training them. Same with helping set up Hezbollah, same with helping Assad regime in Syria in being military attaches there. or even fighting in Bosnia. So these individuals really have quite a record in terms of their extracurricular activities, if you wish, outside the country, but also internally, they have been at the help of many of these crackdowns on social movements that have appeared in Iran. That's why every single one of them was placed on sanctions lists by the US, by the UN, or by EU.
I remember a few years ago when Ahmadinejad was president of Iran, there were allegations that he'd been one of the hostage takers during the U.S. hostage crisis. I think it was never established. It was based on some grainy photographs and so on. But it's been a topic before that the people that are now in the leadership of the country, their experience, the beginnings were forged in the revolution, in, as you mentioned, the Iran-Iraq War that lasted for 8 years. How does that experience, that background, inform the way they make decisions now? And in particular, of course, for the U.S. and the West, how does that background inform the way that they think and the way that they deal with other countries?
That's a very good question. Yes, I think it's supremely important. The Iran-Iraq War, I would describe, was a baptism by fire for these individuals, right? They did not really have any serious military training. Some of them had not even served in the conscript army of Iran at the time, and yet they were put in positions of leadership as commanders of this brigade or that brigade during the war, right? So it was a experience of trial and error on their part to learn, right, the basics of military warfare. But, of course, the fact that the war lasted 8 years provided ample opportunity for them to learn, whatever lessons needed to be learned, although at a huge cost, right? So to this day, when you talk to Iranian war veterans, everyone talks about these foolish decisions that this individual, Mohsen Rezai, for example, made in one of these campaigns, where all indications were that the Iraqis had, the Iranian attack plan had been revealed to the Iraqis. So the element of surprise had been taken out. And yet, this individual, as the commander of the IRGC, he insisted that the attack should go on. The result were thousands and thousands of Iranian casualties, right? And so it's one of those experiences that to this day has been hard for the Iranians, to digest all those, young kids who were killed in that episode. But more importantly, I would say they also learned a political lesson. The political lesson was that, as the expression goes, nobody scratches your back except your own fingers, right? And so they learned the lesson about the need for becoming more self sufficient. Therefore, you saw this very concentrated effort on the part of the IRGC to try to produce many of the ammunitions that it needed, because, again, understanding that they were subject to all sorts of sanctions, it was not easy to smuggle all these things in. And because they had such a massive plan for, rearming themselves, etc., they invested heavily in this thing. So my point is that if this group of individuals are reluctant to trust intermediaries like the United Nations, for example, right, it is because of the experiences that they think they endured. For example, you hear this in when you read their memoirs, when Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons against Iranian soldiers, right? And many of these folks, again, became, in one way or another, either casualties of those chemical attacks or lost buddies as a result of that. Then, it changed their sense of what is defense, what is offense, right? In that regard. So I think now we are dealing with these individuals hardened by the Iran-Iraq War, by the involvement in Lebanon, by the involvement in Bosnia, and then lately in Syria, and not to mention, everything that has happened post 2003 in Iraq and Afghanistan. That again, they were involved in campaigns here and there. So battle hardened individuals, not necessarily trusting of the outside world, believing that might is right approach, and that you better push for what you want. I think that's the aggressiveness that we see, and that has been further validated by the elimination of the supreme leader and other commanders, right, in the Israeli and American air raids. So that's why I think it's a bit naive that to expect these folks to necessarily back down at this point and make concessions. Their reading of the situation is, we are ascendant. This is our moment, and let's milk it for what it's worth.
Yeah, I believe you have a book about the Iranian leadership that is should be on the desk of everybody who's dealing with them.
Yes, I have this 900-page book called Post-Revolutionary Iran, a Political Handbook, which frankly I consider to be a political encyclopedia of post-revolutionary Iran. It has biographies of 2,300 individuals. It has all sorts of information about political parties, election results, nepotism ties among elites, and a massive chronology of what has happened in the country, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, really, it's a who is who of Iranian politics, what you need to know about these individuals, and I can say it's a labor of love that has consumed more than 2 decades of my time.
I can imagine. What are we getting wrong? We're sitting across the table from these people, we, the West, and so on. What are we missing? What is it that the people who talk to them don't understand?
Yeah, I think there are really a number of things, and in the course of my involvement with policy world in Washington, I have learned this lesson, unfortunately, again and again, and that is the fact that for many policymakers, they have this caricature image of Iran, right? Iran as the land of crazy sword swinging ayatollahs, um, not recognizing the dynamics that were set free as a result of a popular revolution, right? Not quite understanding the ideological lore of this type of Islamic state, right? So imagine, for example, for the proponents, supporters of the Islamic Republic, Iran was supposed to be the equivalent to Soviet Union for the communist movement, right? It was supposed to be the utopia, embodiment of the utopia, etc. So the Islamic Republic was born again without any blueprint, right? It flew in the face of everything we knew about modern revolutions. Modern revolutions were all undertaken in the name of secular reasons, right? Separation of church and state, socialism, and the like, right? We had no experience with the theocratic revolution, right? Where the modes of organization, leading personalities, slogans were religiously inspired, right? And so when these people came to power, again, emboldened by their experiences such as the hostage taking, such as the Iran-Iraq war, such as their involvement in the region, right? They tried to uh, hit above their weight, right? They tried to change the country's reality as well as regional reality and international reality to their liking. So whether it was Iran's rivalry with Saudi Arabia about who speaks for the Muslim world, whether it was trying to um, diminish the appeal of pre-Islamic cultural traditions in Iran for the ordinary citizens, right? The Islamic Republic was fighting a war on multiple fronts, right? And with of course, mixed results. In many of these campaigns, they were facing an uphill battle and could not get to what it is that they wanted. So, for example, the imposition of the veil, right, on Iranian ladies, proved to be an unpopular, campaign that after 47 years, the regime has basically given up on that thing because they know it's not going anywhere, right? Or the campaign to export their revolution to the region. Again, when you look around, there is no second Islamic Republic modeled upon the Iranian model in the region. So they failed in that regard as well. And yet, I think that's answering your question. This is my second important point. Not only they are not crazy lunatics, if anything, they are quite rational. They might be aggressive in pushing the envelope, but they are not irrational, right? Um, the second point to keep in mind is that when you have a popular revolution giving birth to an authoritarian regime, according to political science literature, authoritarian regimes that are born through a popular revolution are hard to overthrow, right? You cannot bring them down with a bombing campaign, right? They manage to coup-proof themselves, creating parallel militaries, etc., as the Islamic Republic has done, to make sure that they do not get toppled thanks to a military coup, right? So when you study Iran seriously, and writing this book forced me to really spend, as I said, considerable uh, amount of time looking at these intricate factors, right? About the longevity, about the durability of these regimes. Um, you realize, Andrea, some of the things that perhaps folks in Washington do not understand. So, one of the information I was gathering in this book was that I wanted to know the father's occupation of these individuals, right? To figure out what was their class background, where do they come from, and guess what? To my surprise, they realized that the majority of these 2,300 individuals, they are the sons of farmers, peasants, right? They really come from very modest backgrounds. So you are dealing with a group of Mr. Nobodies who, thanks to the revolution, became Mr. Somebodies. And therefore, these folks are in no hurry to let go of the newly gained privileges and benefits that they have accumulated, right? That's why their commitment to the state is not just an ideological one. The commitment is also economic, right? One of the individuals that I mentioned in that article that belonged to this militant group and was killed by the Israelis, Ali Shamkhani, right? His sons have gone on to create the most impressive, right, shipping company for Iran to bypass sanctions. And they are helping not only Iran, but they are also helping Russia to bypass its sanctions. They sell Russian and Iranian oil in the black markets. They are the ones that are shipping the missiles that Iran, has provided Russia, etc. Last year, Bloomberg did a fantastic documentary on the shipping empire that Mr. Shamkhani's sons have created. And when you watch that documentary and you see what type of front organizations they have created from all the way from Malaysia to Dubai to the Caribbean, right? You begin to realize, far from being uh, stupid, these guys have really learned, how to uh, benefit, how to enrich themselves, engage in Bitcoin, transactions and the like, to make an art out of bypassing sanctions. So when a group of, a segment of the Iranian population, both inside and outside the country, were hoping, in my view, sort of, in a futile manner, that a bombing raid is going to topple this regime and bring about regime change, it was hard for me to, not laugh at that type of a reasoning, knowing how, outrageous, how outlandish such a scenario was to get rid of the Islamic Republic.
So, with the killing of the current supreme leader's father, Ali Khamenei, and well, the mystery of Mushtaba, since we haven't heard or seen him actually, of course, since the war began. How has the power dynamic changed inside Iran? Because there's talk of the fact that the IRGC has even more power than it did before. Is that the case? And what does that actually mean? Because it's not like they didn't have a lot of power before the war.
That's true. They were very powerful, before, the war, but even more so now for the following reason. Look, Ali Khamenei, he had 37 years as the supreme leader to consolidate his power base, right? He was one of chief lieutenants of Ayatollah Khomeini. He was there from the get-go. Indeed, he supervised, the creation of the IRGC, in the early 1980s, right? So he was there from the moment of inception, right? His son has none of those credentials, right? He has not been around. He has not held any, elected office. Ali Khamenei served for 8 years as president of the country, right? 7 years of which were during the Iran-Iraq War, right? So he had a lot of credentials, sort of revolutionary credentials to his name that the son doesn't have. Besides, the son is inheriting the country at a bleak moment, right? We don't know his own, well-being, how hurt he must have been in this thing. We don't know, much about his IQ, his reasoning, his, crisis management skills, right? All of those things are unknown to us. What we do know is that, the Israeli and the American war against Iran demonstrated a few points. A, massive intelligence penetration of the country, right? So much so that you know where the bedrooms of these individuals are, and you can, kill them in their sleep or, in their meetings, etc. So massive intelligence failure in that sense. Furthermore, what remains of the regime feels that, the only thing they have that have saved them so far is the IRGC's missiles and drones and the fighting capacity, right? Therefore, these elderly clerics, particularly the revolutionary generation, right? They are at an advanced age where they recognize, they owe everything, their privileges, their offices, etc., to to these revolutionary guards. So my argument is that revolutionary guards started as a group of bodyguards for the clerics. Now they have become the top dogs, right? The former bodyguards have now become the top dogs. And so my worry is this, that in the aftermath of this war, we are going to be confronting a regime that is even more so than before led by military intelligence types who have that black and white view of politics, right? You are either my foe or a friend, right? And that, they are going to be utilizing force as they are unfortunately doing, over the last few weeks as the, rate of executions, public hangings, etc., in the country has gone up. So it's hard for me to imagine that Iran is going to be anytime soon on the path to transitioning to a democratic state, right? Because the scenario seems to be people are upset. There is massive political alienation. Every once in a while, you have these periodic social movements that appear, and yet because they are not consistent, right? Because they have some serious handicaps. For example, unlike Ayatollah Khomeini back in 78, 79, Iranian opposition has no capability about trying to paralyze the economy, right? So the regime gets a breathing space and is able to clobber these movements every time they raise their heads. And the scenario repeats itself.
So Iran is officially on its third ever supreme leader, and the previous two clearly were. I mean, it's in the name, supreme leader. There is no doubt, of course, that Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the revolution, if you will, and of the Islamic Republic, that he had supreme authority. And as you said, after 37 years, Ali Khamenei, as the supreme leader who followed, had certainly gathered all the power around him, and he really was the supreme leader as well. Now, we know that even President Pezeshkian has said that communication is difficult with Mujtaba. We have to assume that there's something pretty serious going on with him, certainly with how he looks, because they don't show his face, perhaps with his voice, because we haven't heard his voice since he assumed power. So we don't have that person in that role. Who is the person who, if you have to pick up your phone and talk to one person in Iran now who can make the key decisions like, do we negotiate? Do we continue the war and so on? Who is that person, or who are those people, the handful? Who's on top?
Yeah, very good question. So I would say that if I was going to venture a guess, right, the names that come to my mind are people like Muhammad Baqir Zulqar, are people like Ahmad Vahidi, right? Are people like Ghalibaf, or somebody that perhaps the Western audience hasn't heard much about, a gentleman by the name of Ali Reza Erafi, who is in charge of all religious seminaries in the country. He was again one of those favorite lieutenants of Khamenei, who have gone up in the ranks, sits in the Assembly of Religious Experts, and was part of that three-member group that was supposed to lead the country until this declaration of a next supreme leader. So I would say, in terms of political heavyweights, the people who might be making the serious decisions, it's these types, right? And perhaps a few others that might be playing a role. So how decision making authority has really been taken away from the hands of individuals like the president or the foreign minister, right? These folks are now really more so than ever before glorified messenger boys for the real decision makers, right? They might be the outside face of the regime, but the cabinet, the president, etc. They are not calling the shots. The National Security Council, right, in Iran, I would say has become even more important, and maybe not even the entire National Security Council, but a subgroup of individuals within that, right? The real political heavyweights. These are the ones that nowadays count in terms of decision making. Look, one other point here. When the Mujahideen Khalq, right, in the early 1980s, started a military campaign of assassination, bombing that killed the president, prime minister, etc., the regime had one individual that really took hold of everybody else, right, and managed to bring order to the system and take them out of the original shock of the assassination and bombing, and that was Ayatollah Hashemi Rafsanjani, right? He is no longer there. Okay, so that's why when you ask me who are the important ones, I am reluctant to mention any clerics because I think the real decision makers now have become these lay individuals who how New York Times had that a slogan in the front page, all the news that's fit to print, right? So that tells you what? That, what appears on the first page of New York Times, what appears on page 50 makes a difference, right? In terms of agenda setting power. IRGC now has the agenda setting power for the, supreme leader, right? And I think that's That's the significant change that we now need to realize in the aftermath of this war.
To conclude, I want to come back to how we started. And we started talking about the conditions that led to the revolution, this terrible assassination of your father and his colleague, really just 6 weeks or so before the revolution actually finally happened. That was impending clearly at that point. And now here we are in 2026. You already alluded to the fact that the conditions aren't really there for various reasons because the regime has had time to kind of coup-proof itself. Do you see any conditions under which there would actually be uh, some change based on the unpopularity of the regime? I don't think there's anyone who actually believes that the regime has the support of the majority of its people. And we know what happened. There was a bloody, those massacres of January 8th and 9th after the most recent series of demonstrations. So is it just not going to happen? I mean, will the Islamic Republic with the leadership that you've described likely to last for quite some time to come? Or do you see some cracks somewhere that might be occurring?
Well, I hope not, right? That's the first point. No, I really don't think that they're going to last forever. Look, for a variety of reasons, right? So I'm a political scientist, and from a political sociology perspective, when I look at Iran over the last 4 decades, I see a society that has changed in fundamental ways, right? Uh, for the first time in its history, post-revolutionary Iran has become a society where the majority of the population lives in urban centers. First time in its history, the majority of the population have become educated, right? This is still a relatively young population, right? Median age is still, 32, fluctuates between 28 to 32. So you put these three elements together, a population that is young, educated, and urban, right? In political science, we say that's a recipe for disaster. Why? Because it creates a revolution of rising expectations. The people come to expect more from the government. And when the government is incapable of responding to their needs, I am a young man, I want to get married, I have a family, right? So I need a job, I want to be able to afford housing and so forth. So, because the government is incapable of responding to these very legitimate demands of the citizenry, a crisis of legitimacy has come about, right? So the Islamic Republic, in my view, its Achilles heel are the following. A, it is insisting on a set of ideological dictates that this urban educated young population is not able to digest, right? And therefore, whether it's women's wailing, whether it's censorship of the internet, etc., you know, uh, the backlash is immense. All right. So that crisis of legitimacy has happened. Second factor is that economically speaking, everyone realizes that the standard of living for average Iranians, but in particular for the middle class, right, has dramatically declined. So, for example, when I look at the type of privileges that a middle class family used to enjoy before the revolution, right, in terms of housing, cars, vacations that they used to take either inside the country or outside the country, and you look at their situation right now, you see what a massive decline has happened there. So there is dissatisfaction in that sense as well. Politically, this is a regime that had basically divides the entire citizenry to those in inner circle and everybody else who is outside, right? And the parameters of that, what they consider the inner circle, sort of the core revolutionaries, keeps contracting, right? More and more. So, for example, the reformists who were sort of partners in crime for these revolutionary rulers now become left out, right, and etc. Even segments of the hardliners, like Ahmadinejad, etc. So you put all these facts together, and you can see that the Islamic Republic will have a impossible task in terms of winning over the citizenry, right? And in my view, it's a matter of time before these expectations catch up with them, right? When we exactly don't know, because it's a dynamic relationship. It depends on the power of the state, power of civil society, etc. Right? Fluctuating. But the handwriting on the wall, if I was sitting in one of the Iranian regime's think tanks, the handwriting on the wall is not encouraging, right? Because you are facing massive external pressure, massive internal pressure. And the question really become, well, when is that fracture going to appear?
Mehrdad Bouroujerdi, this has really been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for your time and your insights. This has really been informative. Thank you.
No, I appreciate the opportunity.
خیلی ممنون.
Merci.